Welcome to episode 3 of Idiom America. They say third time's a charm and that good things come in threes. But they also say bad things in trouble. Both come in threes as well, so who knows? Lots of things seem to come in threes, like little pigs, blind mice, billy goats gruff, bears with porridge, musketeers, amigos, stooges, people walking into a bar in the setup of a joke, etc. The other night, I heard a woman talking about how she was fit to be tied. And it's a phrase I heard a fair bit growing up. And when I read the definitions provided by dictionaries, they define it as being extremely angry or enraged or very agitated. But in the context I heard it the other night and growing up, there was more of a playful feeling to it, like the person wasn't seriously angry, but that it was just a short-term reaction to someone doing something stupid or pulling a prank on them or something. I even heard it growing up being used in a way that seemed to suggest more of an amused confusion, kind of befuddlement at the stupid thing somebody had done. So I think I just kind of always associated the words with the image of somebody who was so perplexed they were immobilized, just kind of stunned to the point where you could easily tie them up, hence fit to be tied. But when I look into the origin of this one a little, it does seem to better fit the dictionary definition and connote extreme anger, even if it's used as an exaggeration of somebody's mental state. Because it turns out that fit to be tied first appears in the early 1800s, and it alludes to the practice of tying up uncontrollable mental patients. And at first, they'd tie them up with rope or cloth, but that eventually gave way to the straitjacket, which was invented in France around 1790. So that's pretty extreme when you get to the point that you're so upset that you have to be physically restrained in a straitjacket. This phrase also seems like similar to a few of those phrases that first came from the medical or psychological lexicon, then they enter ordinary usage and they mean something similar, just to a much lesser degree. I'm thinking about terms like moron or imbecile, for example, which started out as technical scientific jargon. In this vein is also the word mad, for example. Best I can tell, its most archaic usage is to mean silly, crazy, insane. Yet kind of like with the mental patient who was so angry that they were considered fit to be tied up in a straitjacket, we've come to use mad not to refer only to clinical insanity, but also to just being upset about something. And the first use of fit to be tied in the figurative sense that I can find on Ingram is from an 1804 letter, or as it refers to itself, an epistle, which is titled Vindication of the Most Reverend John Thomas Troy, a Roman Catholic Archbishop in the Church of Dublin. And this is one of those publications, like the U.S. Bill of Rights, that's old enough that if you take a look at the text, some of the lowercase s's appear not as the S we're familiar with, but as an F, which, despite looking like an F, is referred to as a long S. And apparently the long S's origins go all the way back to Roman times, and it has to do with the mechanics of handwriting and cursive writing. But this long S or F, or used as an S, was also used not only with the Latin language, but all sorts of languages adopted, like French, German, various Slavic and Caucasian languages that use the Latin alphabet, to name a few. There was a whole series of complicated rules about when to use the long S versus the more familiar short S, and these rules, of course, change with place and time. But apparently the use of this long S in English typography disappeared pretty abruptly around 1800, and so the 1804 epistle was a bit behind the times. And I just took a glance at it, and it appears that this epistle mounts quite the defense of the good Archbishop Troy. But it gets bogged down in too much argument about who said what about whatever canon or doctrine, and what it means to be a good Catholic versus a heretical one versus a Protestant, for me to be too interested in taking a closer look. But the passage where fit to be tied comes from is kind of along those lines, and it reads, "You will also recollect that Collier, a Protestant, and Dupin, a Papist, reject the canon in question as spurious, and the allowance of this opinion in a Papist should be for any man, not fit to be tied, a proof that Catholic faith or morals are in no manner interested in its truth of fact. So it's a bit confusing, but I guess the gist of this passage is that even if Archbishop Troy were to express some kind of opinion about some canon, he'd still be vindicated, at least in the eyes of any man not fit to be tied or completely off his rocker or crazy. And now that I say that, I wonder about the phrase off his rocker, but I'll put a pin in that for now and maybe come back to it some other time. So it seems that the original meaning of the phrase fit to be tied did indeed refer to the crazy or insane. But by the 1920s at least, it was well into its current usage of referring to somebody as upset or angry. And one interesting example of this comes from a book of short stories from Georgia in 1925, where the author felt the need to explain the meaning and origin of this phrase, writing, "He was, as the Irish say of the distraught, fit to be tied," which of course indicates that the term wasn't super widespread by then and needed to be explained, that it was considered to originate in Ireland, and that by that point it had taken on the meaning of being upset or distraught. At any rate, I think this is an idiom I might use now more than I did before after learning of its origin. I kind of like the thought of exaggerating how upset I was by implying that it would have been good if somebody would have come along and put me in a straitjacket. From what I understand, they're not much in use anymore in mental health units. It's not like one flew over the cuckoo's nest these days, so that's not an issue. Anyway, tying stuff up in general is a pretty important part of life. Of course, even more so back in the old days, thinking about idiomatic expressions like hog-tied. But a whole lot of us still begin each day by tying our shoelaces, and I, for one, tie my dental floss into a circle before flossing. And people still fish and boat and ride horses and tie knots for stuff like that. And some people still tie a necktie around their neck every morning. So the act of joining ropes or strings together or making a knot, it's still around as a pretty basic daily thing. So it's no surprise that there is no shortage of idioms that relate to tying, as well as its opposite. You think about something like cutting the Gordian knot, for example. First one that comes to mind is you can tie your whole self in knots, or get really confused or discombobulated in a difficult situation. Or maybe you just tie your tongue and get too shy or unable to speak. And as an aside, another idiom for tongue-tied has the cat got your tongue. It has its own interesting origin stories, although they're a bit dark. This phrase has been around since at least 1881, which is the earliest I can find on Ingram, with the reference in a magazine to it being a phrase that children use. But the phrase probably goes back much further than that, and one origin story says that the phrase "cat got your tongue" arose back when the British Royal Navy sailed the seven seas in the 1700s. And soldiers who were deemed in need of punishment would sometimes be brutally flogged with a cat o' nine tails. And this was a torture device like a whip, only worse, as it had 9 leather rope straps attached to it, and each of those straps had 3 knots. And the captain might flog a sailor anywhere from 5 to 100 times, and sometimes the whipping could make someone pass out. So saying "cat got your tongue" meant you'd been flogged into submission or silence. Other stories include those about witches and black cats who some thought did the work of the evil witches and would steal your tongue so you couldn't report their witchcraft to the authorities. And then some think the phrase "cat got your tongue" goes all the way back to ancient Egypt and the worship of cats in that culture. And apparently those crimes of the mouth, think about lying or speaking out of turn or class or speaking it out against the government or the established religion, they would be punished by cutting out your tongue as retribution. And your tongue would then be fed to a nearby cat. And silencing critics in this manner kept everyone else in line while the religious elite and royalty maintained their power. And this one seems likely to me. The Bible is full of people cutting tongues out. Proverbs 10:31, "The mouth of the just bringeth forth wisdom, but the froward tongue shall be cut out." And by the way, froward in this sense means willful and disobedient. Judas Maccabeus from 2 Maccabees 15:33, Then he cut out the tongue of that godless man, promising to feed it bit by bit to the birds and to hang up his head opposite the temple as evidence of what his foolishness did for him. And the fact that this one appears in more than a few languages supports this ancient origin, I think. Spanish has Te ha comido la lengua el gato, and Serbian has Pojela ti maca jezik. But back to tongue-tied. Tongue-tied is another one of those phrases that started out as a medical term, and it's still used as a medical term, but its technical name is ankyloglossia, and it's a condition present at birth that restricts the tongue's range of motion because a band of tissue called a frenulum tethers the bottom of the tongue's tip to the floor of the mouth. And it can often cause problems with breastfeeding, speech, licking an ice cream cone, kissing. So it's often removed via a simple surgical procedure called a frenotomy, in which the doctor uses a pair of scissors to snip the frenulum free. I gotta say, I like the phrase tongue-tied better than ankyloglossia. It gets to the point and aptly describes a physical abnormality in an easy-to-understand way. Some more examples like that are clubfoot or hair lip or lazy eye or webbed fingers. Even without knowing much about these conditions, you can kind of understand what they entail. Although I suppose if I had the condition myself, I might prefer a more clinical term that was a little less easy to associate with the physical condition. And there are some other tying idioms that make pretty good sense without a whole lot of investigation. Tied to somebody's apron strings is one of those, used to refer to a man or boy that is controlled or dominated by a woman, usually a mother or wife. That paints a pretty good picture. And I always liked a Serbian word that conveys the same meaning, papučar. And it refers to papuče, or the slippers that Serbs wear around the home, and it conveys the same idea of a man who's so domesticized that he's tied to his slippers. Another one of those tying idioms I've always liked is to tie one on, and I've always pictured somebody tying on a bib, just ready to go at it, whether it be food or alcohol, must be damned. And maybe my mental image is as good as any other explanation for the origin, as there doesn't seem to be a good one. Some claim that the phrase dates back to the Wild West, where a cowboy would have to tie up his horse to a hitching post before he could go into the saloon and get drunk. But that doesn't really fit, and there doesn't seem to be that much evidence for it. Others speculate it comes from what is apparently an old British slang term for getting drunk, tie a bun on. And where that phrase comes from is, again, anybody's best guess. And one of them is that long ago, one way to prove you were sober was to walk around with a bun balanced on your head. And so if you were drunk, you'd tie the bun to your head so it wouldn't fall off. I don't know, my bib is sounding better and better, I think. Another thing I'd throw out there is pure speculation, is that this phrase seemed to come into popularity in the 1920s or 30s or so. So maybe it had something to do with prohibition. I'm not sure what, but I'm sure there were all kinds of secret rites that one would sometimes have to go through to get something to drink in some underground speakeasy somewhere. And maybe somehow they involved tying something on. Who knows? Sounds as good as walking around with a bun tied to your head to prove you're sober. Finally, I'll end up with tying the knot, which is perhaps the granddaddy of all the tying idioms. And there are those that claim this expression's etymology is unknown and that the theories that do exist are not rooted in fact. However, there are a few that stand out as being most likely, I think. And the first comes from an ancient Celtic practice that can be traced back to the medieval era in Scotland. And this was called a hand fasting. And in it, a couple who were to be engaged, they would have their hands tied together with cloth or ribbon, binding them together and making them one. And the hand fasting's purpose was to strengthen the bond between the couple before the official wedding. So this first hand fasting would take place a year and a day before the official marriage, where a second hand fasting would take place. And some say that this first hand fasting was a betrothal or an engagement ceremony, while others say it just starts a trial period and that the second hand fasting would only take place if the couple got along in the year and a day. And hand fasting ceremonies, they're still around in Scotland and elsewhere and are recognized as legally binding. And lots of other classical cultures have ceremonies similar to the Celtic hand fasting one, or ceremonies in which knots are used, such as the ancient Mayan or the Jewish or the Hindu Vedic cultures, and knots are used in other cultures too. In the Roman times, a bride would wear a belt tied in a Hercules knot, and it was incorporated into the bride's protective girdle that the groom would ceremonially untie, which sounds like the opposite of tying the knot, but I suppose the knot had to be tied in the first place. And then in some Western European wedding ceremonies, little true lovers' knots are given out to guests, representing love and fidelity. And there are plenty of instructions on the internet for how to tie one of these knots, for those interested. And there are other theories besides the hand fasting ceremony to explain the origin of the phrase tie the knot, but none of them are convincing to me. For example, some say that it refers to the nets of knotted string which supported beds prior to the introduction of metal spring bed frames. And the theory goes that in order to make a marriage bed, you needed to first tie the knot. When I think of tying the knot to get married, I also think of a companion idiom, getting hitched. I think of a couple knots I used to tie as a boy, a clove hitch that I'd use to tie up my horse to a hitching post, and then the half hitch, which I'd use for all kinds of stuff. And it turns out that there are a whole lot more hitch knots out there than that, maybe 30 or so. Who knew? At any rate, the expression getting hitched originated in America in the 1600s and was used to describe tying horses to wagons or farm implements, and then later, maybe 1700s, 1800s, it began to be used to describe two people getting married. And the idea is that getting married is a lot like teaming a pair of horses together to pull that wagon or plow. And I like this image for marriage a lot. You're both hitched to the wagon, so you're in it together, and you have to learn to be compatible if you weren't in the first place. And it helps if you both pull, but sometimes one horse or the other can pull more than its share of the load when needed. I also really like the idea of incorporating tying a knot into a wedding ceremony, especially some kind of ceremony in which the couple has to go out and learn and then tie some knots that bind them together. Seems to me it'd have more significance and impact than simply putting a ring on it. Finally, to bring it back to a different kind of tongue tying, I really like this quote by a guy named Francis Gose from 1811. "He has tied a knot with his tongue that he cannot untie with his teeth. That is, he is married."